Every abandoned object or place tells a story. They might be abandoned now, but once they had a purpose. Just because they've become abandoned, though, doesn't mean that they have to be forgotten. Some of the most interesting sights to see in the world are abandoned places, and if they could talk, they would have some pretty remarkable tales to tell. Let's tell some of those tales right now in this video. If ever a building looked haunted, it's this abandoned former mansion in the Hudson Valley area of New York State. It might seem like the perfect creepy setting for a horror movie, but it was actually once the highly prestigious Bennett College for girls. It might look battered and broken now, but that's because it's been left alone for over 40 years. Before the rot set in, parents used to try every trick in the book to land their daughters a place inside its hallowed walls. The first classes here began in 1890 and continued for much of the following century until the end came in 1978. By that time, the school's reputation for snobbery and elitism had become more prominent than its reputation for academic excellence, and demand for places had dried up. The exterior of the property is in worse condition than the interior, which still contains school books and equipment. The entire premises has been scheduled for demolition several times in the past 4 decades, only to be spared at the 11th hour. Looking at the state of it, it may soon fall down on its own, without any assistance from a wrecking ball. While we're in the state of New York, we should also check out the abandoned ruins of Gringers Resort in Liberty. It's a shabby, twisted wreck these days, but back in the 1950s, this getaway in the Catskills was the height of sophistication for affluent New Yorkers in search of a weekend break. In fact, it was so popular that the influential magazine Commentary said in 1954 that Gringers was the Waldorf of the Borscht Belt. This was the first resort in the United States of America to use artificial snow for all year-round skiing activities. And it was also used by legendary boxer Rocky Marciano as a training camp. From its humble origins as a basic hotel opening in 1917, Gringers grew and grew until 1972, when owner Jenny Grosinger passed away. From there, it entered a steep decline and closed for the final time in 1986. Nature has since reclaimed much of the site, and what's left of it is scheduled to be demolished to make way for a new property development. Mount Rushmore isn't the only collection of disembodied presidential heads in the United States of America. There's also President's Park, or at least what's left of it. Back when it was open, this was arguably far more impressive as a sculpture collection than Mount Rushmore. There are only 4 faces on the mountain, but giant busts of the first 43 U.S. presidents once stood inside the park. All of the busts still exist, but these days they're in Williamsburg, Virginia, and they're in a poor state of repair. The park closed in 2010 and left the 20-foot-tall heads without a permanent home. Park owner Howard Hankins wasn't sure what to do with them, but he felt that destroying them would be a disrespectful act, and so he had them all shipped to his family's private farm in Virginia. That's where they've remained for the past decade. Howard would love them to go back on display somewhere in the future, but they'd need more than a little maintenance before that can happen. If you ever find yourself in need of a nuclear bomb shelter, head to Switzerland. The country's 300,000 shelters contain space for approximately 9 million people. The entire population of Switzerland is lower than that, so you'll still have plenty of room, even if everyone decided to get inside them at the same time. There isn't much chance of that happening, though, because almost all of the bunkers are disused, or at least aren't being used for their original purpose. The majority of them were built during the Cold War, starting in the 1950s. The Swiss government had just seen the successful testing of a Soviet nuclear bomb and was convinced the world was on the verge of a full-scale nuclear war. Those in charge thought the only way to protect the public was to build shelters for everybody, and so that's exactly what they did. More shelters were made after the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1963, and even more after the Japanese Fukushima nuclear disaster in 2011. This constant anxiety about an impending nuclear disaster appears to be a uniquely Swiss condition, and it's led to miles of forgotten and empty tunnels being built. Mining towns can be built up very quickly after the discovery of anything worth mining underground, but they can also disappear just as fast when that natural resource runs out. That's the tale of Alaska's Kencott mining town in just a few words. Copper was discovered in the Alaskan region of Chitina during the early years of the 20th century, and mining companies quickly moved in to start digging it up. Their workers needed somewhere to live, and so Kencott was built to house them. By the 1930s, the town had its own hospital, school, church, bar, and railway station. That was the peak of the town's existence. But the end came more quickly than anyone expected it to when the copper seam ran out in 1938. The mines were shut down, the trains stopped running, and the occupants of the town had to go elsewhere in search of work. These days, all of their former homes stand empty, and the only people you'll see on its streets are visitors and tourists. Many of the old buildings are now on America's National Register of Historic Places. Residents of Japan didn't have the option of leaving the country for vacations during the 1950s and 1960s, so the government did its best to give them places closer to home to stay and relax. One such place was the once glorious Hao Royal Hotel on the island of Hachijojima in the Philippine Sea. This beautiful region was hailed as Japan's version of Hawaii by those who promoted it, and it could be reached from Tokyo by ferry in a few short hours. The hotel was designed in the classic French Baroque style, complete with replica Greek statues made from plaster standing in the gardens, and enormous water fountains. The resort was aimed at the Japanese middle class, and they came to it in their droves. Times changed as the years passed in the Japanese nation, though, and eventually the public regained the ability to go abroad again. They no longer had a reason to visit the Japanese Hawaii when they could jump on a plane and see the real one. Several attempts to remarket the hotel under a number of different names failed, and the business was declared bankrupt in 2006. Without anyone to maintain the building, the hot saltwater climate has broken the building down rapidly, and vegetation has penetrated every part of the interior. In some cases, it even grows around the computers that were left behind when the hotel closed. The derelict military hospital in Belitz, Germany, is the stuff of nightmares. Known as the Belitz Heilstätten in its native tongue, this is where future Nazi dictator Adolf Hitler recuperated after being temporarily blinded and suffering a leg wound during the Battle of the Somme in the First World War. The imposing-looking medical facility was built in 1898 and was intended to be a sanatorium for the treatment of people with lung issues, although its duties were expanded during the war. It repeated its field hospital duties during the Second World War, but in 1945 it was occupied by Soviet forces and remained in use as a Soviet military hospital until 1995. That's long after the dissolution of the Soviet Union itself, and also after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Most of the 60 buildings that made up the old hospital are now disused, including the old surgery wards and the chilling psychiatric ward. There was even a rifle range here, which also lies in ruins. During more recent years, it's been used as a filming location for the Roman Polanski movie The Pianist, and it's had a canopied pathway fitted to its exterior to allow visitors a better view of what remains inside. While most of the abandoned locations in our video can be visited by the public, we wouldn't recommend getting too close to this next one. It's the ghost town of Jamana in Romania, and its abandonment was forced in 1978 when the area was deliberately flooded to make way for a new copper mine in the region. The plan was drawn up by the country's communist leader, Nicolae Ceausescu, who apparently had little regard for the people who called this place home. Approximately 20 hardened villagers have clung on to their homes in the town, but the water edges closer to their homes with every passing year. That's particularly bad news because the water is hugely toxic thanks to the sludge and waste products from the mine. The spire of the old town's church is still visible above the murky mess, as are a few rooftops and the occasional foreboding gravestone. The swirling colors of the unnatural lake might be considered beautiful, but in reality they're caused by sulfur, iron, and copper residue that would be fatal to ingest. Our next ghost town would be much more pleasant to spend time in than Jamana. It's Kocco, in the Italian province of Matera, and it sits high on a particularly scenic hillside. This was a busy, thriving town for more than 1,400 years and survived plague, tribes of barbarians, and 2 world wars. But an enormous landslide finally put an end to human settlement here in 1991. While the people may have gone, the beautiful buildings they created over the centuries they lived here still remain. The town's castle, built in the year 1300, is especially noteworthy and contains a statue of the Virgin Mary that's said to have been found in a nearby lake in mysterious circumstances. The statue is the town's one remaining link to the outside world. Each year, a religious festival is held with the statue as its centerpiece, and thousands of people from the surrounding area come to fill Kocco with life once more. It's no longer possible to stay here overnight, but the views of the surrounding area from inside the town make any walk or hike worthwhile. The old fishing village of Hutuan in China might be abandoned, but it would be wrong to call it lifeless. That would be disrespectful to the enormous amount of vegetation that coats every surface here, enveloping the buildings like a protective cloak. Fishing was a way of life here for centuries, but eventually the village reached saturation point. To put it in simple terms, there were too many people trying to fish here, and not enough fish to go around. One by one, the population of 2,200 people packed up and moved elsewhere, some of them leaving their personal effects inside their old homes when they left. Because almost the entire village is now a vivid shade of green, it's become something of a tourist attraction. In many cases, the people who provide guided tours of the region are the same people who once worked here as fishermen. Remarkably, Hutuan is only 40 miles from the middle of the modern city of Shanghai. Standing in the middle of it, you'd believe you were 1,000 miles away, and perhaps several hundred years in the past. Moving from China to Japan, there's a forgotten botanical garden in Tokyo that reminds some people of the ruined set of the Jurassic Park movie. This apocalyptic ruin was once Irozaki Jungle Park, but its best years are long ago and far away. The park, which can be found in the country's mountainous Izu Peninsula, opened in 1969 as both a botanical garden and a theme park, but its entertainment offerings were considered feeble in comparison to the bigger, brighter attractions that existed elsewhere in Japan by the 1990s. It limped on for a few more years, but it finally lost the battle for survival in 2003. The doors closed, and they've never officially been opened again since. That hasn't stopped plenty of urban explorers getting inside to take pictures, though. As the park covers an impressive 40,000 square feet, it's thought to be the largest abandoned location of this type in the world. Be very cautious if you intend to visit it yourself, though. We're told there's a thick carpet of insects living on the floors, and some less pleasant creatures hiding among the bushes. You're usually guaranteed a good time if you visit a Six Flags theme park, but there's very little fun or frivolity to be found at the closed-down Six Flags Park in New Orleans, Louisiana, USA. The park opened in the year 2000 and was still shiny and new when Hurricane Katrina struck in August 2005. Much of New Orleans was devastated by the hurricane, and the theme park was damaged beyond repair. As politicians and local authorities debate what to do with the battered site, it's become overrun with wildlife and overgrown with foliage, to the point that it's now considered both dangerous and an eyesore by people living close to it. It was finally decided that demolition would be the most appropriate path to take in July 2019, but the New Orleans government backed off that idea after finding out that it would cost more than $1 million just to knock it all down. Now its future status is unclear once more, although it's very occasionally used as a filming location for television shows and movies.
Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and enjoy watching new videos on my channel. Thanks for watching, and see you soon!